as we go more deeply into the Easter season, we approach the Feast of Pentecost when we celebrate the outpouring of the Holy Spirit upon the church with great power. And so as we approach that feast, in the readings at Mass, the Holy Spirit becomes more prominent in our readings, as the Holy Spirit is more prominent in our readings today. The Holy Spirit, the third person of the most blessed Trinity, has been active in creation since the very beginning of creation and has been present for all of eternity, even prior to creation. But the identity of the Holy Spirit in the Old Testament was somewhat obscure. We hear about the presence of the Holy Spirit even in the first few lines of the Bible from Genesis. I'll just read the first few lines. In the beginning, when God created the heavens and the earth was without form or shape, with darkness over the abyss, and the Spirit of God sweeping over the waters. Then God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. So the Spirit of God is present at creation. Though more obscure than we recognize the Holy Spirit now, with the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Holy Spirit has been revealed more explicitly and clearly. One of the most significant manifestations of the Holy Spirit in the gospel is at the baptism of the Lord, of course, in the Jordan River by John, when the Holy Spirit descended upon Jesus like a dove. And we're told that right after the baptism, we're told that the Holy Spirit drove or led Jesus into the desert for those 40 days of prayer and fasting in preparation for his public ministry. I like this action of the Holy Spirit as driving or leading or guiding, because I think it can be helpful for us as we hopefully strive to understand the role of the Holy Spirit in our own lives as we desire to be mature Christians living the fullness of the Christian life. Sadly, sometimes we get stuck at a less mature discipleship, and there is a constant invitation by the Holy Spirit to be open to the actions of the Holy Spirit, to recognize the inspiration of the Holy Spirit in our personal lives. And this driving or leading or guiding, I think, suggests an analogy that I want to explore a little bit today in something that I've seen in my life change quite a bit. And I think it serves as an analogy for the unfolding of true religion throughout history. And this would be navigation. And for our young people, for those younger than 25, they're not going to maybe even understand some of what I'm talking about. It's so dated and archaic now. The navigation that many of us are familiar with is satellite navigation, we commonly call GPS, and that's going to be really valuable. But to understand how God has acted throughout history, I think it's good to look at the history of navigation, even in my own life, how much it has changed. So when I was first driving, and as some of you my age and older might recall, we used to have paper maps. They were folded into like 64 squares, and you had to unfold them, and they were, and there was the state, right? Often a state was there. I grew up in New England in the Northeast, which made it even more complicated because we've got a bunch of states all close together. So I've got all these maps, and it was some work to try to figure out, all right, how do I get from here to there, right? And then at some point I know I had a fancy spiral-bound travel atlas, which was a little more convenient. It was a book with map after map after map of all the states. So that was handy and convenient in a sense, but still a lot of work compared to what we have now. When I was newly ordained and I started visiting parishioners in their homes, this is only not quite 16 years ago, I know I would go to I wasn't using the maps anymore. I would go to my computer and call up MapQuest, and probably still exists, MapQuest, and I would put in the address, and it would put out all the steps, like, turn here, go a mile, turn there, go a mile, and all the step by step, and I would print it out, and I would have it with me. So this was an improvement, right? Like I had somebody deciphering the map for me and breaking it down into steps that I could read, but it was still a bit cumbersome because I'm trying to drive my car and look at this map or look at these steps on the paper, and an improvement, but still not as nice as we have now, right? I almost never use paper anymore to get where I want to go. In the past, I would be regularly cleaning out my back seat. I had piles of MapQuest directions all scattered in my back seat, and I would sometimes clean that out. But now my phone is simply telling me step by step. I don't have to remember anything. It's just telling me, turn in, 100 feet, go. Just really convenient, right? Really convenient, the GPS that I now use. And I think this progression that I've seen in navigation, in traveling in my own life, we see over the span of about not quite 2,000 years in the history of religion, starting about 1800 with Abraham. Abraham is our first, what we consider historical biblical figure. This is at the end of chapter 11 in Genesis. Prior to that, we consider that, generally speaking, prehistory. It's hard to pin down exact dates. Noah and all those folks, they certainly had a relationship with God, but it was less well defined, right? With Abraham, in about 1800 BC, we have God entering in, the same God, the triune God, entering into relationship with a human being whom he has chosen, Abraham. And I liken this to the stage of navigation when I was using paper maps, right? It was quite mysterious. There was no set location where God abided. There was no temple. God would appear to Abraham and his descendants in various places at different times, but there was no established dwelling place for God. And feels random, hit and miss. God appearing unexpectedly at certain times, but difficult to understand, difficult to predict. About 1250 BC, so 600 or so years later, God makes a covenant with Moses, right? And what God tells Moses is recorded in the first 5 books of the Bible. God gives Moses a law, like a lot of don't do this, a good number of do this, but lots of don't do this. God gives Moses a law. And I kind of think of that as my MapQuest paper list of instructions that I must follow to get to where I want to go. It's a bit cumbersome, right? By one popular accounting, rabbis going through the first 5 books of the Bible, one popular accounting said there were 613 laws that Jewish people were expected to follow. That feels like a lot, right? That feels like a lot of rules to keep track of. 613, and then to be applying those to one's life. It feels cumbersome. In fact, in the first reading, when the apostles are trying to figure out how the Jewish law is, which they had lived because all the apostles were Jewish, how the Jewish law was going to apply to their non-Jewish converts, they were concerned that that law could be a burden, an obstacle to faith in Jesus. There were some laws, and they mentioned one for men in particular that was extremely unpleasant. So they don't want to be overly burdensome, right? And it says here, it is the decision of the Holy Spirit and of us not to place on you any burden beyond the necessities, right? There's a concern that these 613 laws are burdensome. And we hear in the gospel people coming to Jesus saying, what's the most important commandment? Like, what's on the test? The implication being, I can't keep track of all of these laws. Just tell me what's really significant, right? So the law, though valuable and helpful in some ways, was cumbersome. It was a burden, especially for the poor who didn't have free time and resources to study, were not literate. It was simply burdensome. With the covenant that Jesus establishes with us, we have something that I think is much closer to what we enjoy now as far as GPS, that the Holy Spirit has been given to us to help us to navigate all the circumstances of our lives. It's much the Holy Spirit dwelling within us with Jesus, the gift of the Holy Spirit that Jesus gives us. The Holy Spirit now dwells within us and can guide us through all the particular circumstances and details of our lives. Yes, we need the commandments. We need the general rules, the 10 Commandments, some basic moral principles. These are the guardrails. They keep us on the road. They keep us in the moral life. They keep us out of mortal sin by giving us some broad guidelines. But to live a more mature Christian life, we're invited to be paying attention to the inspiration and the actions of the Holy Spirit. But like any other person that we're authentically communicating with, we must try to listen. We must try to listen. There's a difference between hearing and listening, right? I hear noises, I listen to people. Sometimes I don't listen and I just hear people. To listen is to try to understand, to make that effort to understand. And that's what we're invited to do in our relationship with the Holy Spirit. This kind of listening requires some quiet in our lives. The voice of the Holy Spirit, generally speaking, though God works sort of really aggressively in some people's lives, St. Paul, for example, but generally speaking, the Holy Spirit is relatively subtle, more subtle than the many voices that are clamoring for our attention in the media. And so we will, if we want to be listening to the Holy Spirit, we want to make time for quiet. We make time for prayer so that we can hear and become more familiar with the inspirations and the actions of the Holy Spirit in our lives. And as I've tried to understand this for myself and explain to you, I was trying to think, how does this work? What is going on here? And what I recalled is that, for example, if you've ever been, maybe you're at a picnic, and for whatever reason you decided to start the picnic, somebody gives you a Coca-Cola, right? And you're drinking Coca-Cola, a very sweet beverage, right? And then maybe that's fine while you're having your hamburger and hot dog, but then for dessert, they give you watermelon. They give you watermelon for dessert. What's the problem? The problem, as I've experienced it, is that the Coke has so overwhelmed my sense of taste. It has sort of thrown it way off kilter. The Coke is so sweet that now when I will taste the watermelon, I can't taste anything. The sweetness of the watermelon is terrific, probably better than the quality of the Coca-Cola, but it's subtle. And because my senses have been overwhelmed and thrown out of whack by that intense sweetness, I'm not able to enjoy the watermelon, right? So I think this is simply an issue that we face in our own lives. We constantly hear voices in media and other places telling us things, wanting to sell us things, and they're so loud and so constant, they can drown out the voice, the inspirations, the promptings of the Holy Spirit in our lives. And so it's a challenge for us to make time for quiet, to become more comfortable with quiet, so that we can become more familiar with the Holy Spirit speaking to us. The prophet Jeremiah spoke of this in the Old Testament, and Jesus is clearly aware of this when he establishes his new covenant, the covenant that Jeremiah spoke about. And I'll read this short passage from chapter 31 of Jeremiah. See, days are coming when I will make a new covenant with the house of Israel. It will not be like the covenant I made with their ancestors, but this is the covenant I will make with the house of Israel after those days. I will place my law within them and write it upon their hearts. I will be their God, they shall be my people. So even Jeremiah, the prophet, hundreds of years before Jesus, was able to see that a time would come when the law would not be simply written on the stone tablets of the Ten Commandments or on the scrolls that were used in the synagogue, but that the law, God's law, would be interiorized, written on our hearts. And this is the gift of the Holy Spirit. This is the gift of the Holy Spirit that's made available to us by and through Jesus. That abiding presence of the Holy Spirit comes to us in the waters of baptism, and we remembered that at the beginning of Mass today with the sprinkling rite. That gift of the Holy Spirit, that abiding presence. I spoke earlier when I was doing the history of true religion. We had, up to the time of Abraham, there was no temple. With Moses, there's a tabernacle. Then with David and Solomon, really, there's the temple where God abides in Jerusalem. But now with the new covenant, each of us is a temple. Each of us has the Holy Spirit dwelling within us. We receive that in baptism. In confirmation, we are that those gifts, that presence is strengthened so that we can hear more clearly what God is asking us to do as mature Christians in the world. And certainly it is in our regular celebration of the Eucharist that we're able to hopefully fine-tune our spiritual sense. In Holy Communion, when the Lord comes to us in his body and blood, the Holy Spirit comes as well, and we become more and more attuned to the promptings and the action of the Holy Spirit in our lives. So may we embrace that invitation of intimacy with God. May we do those things required to listen and be attentive to the promptings of the Holy Spirit in our lives. And may the Eucharist we celebrate and communion we receive help us to hear God more clearly.